Good morning and welcome to Anti-Chevron Day 2020. My name is Paul Pazimino. I am the Associate Director at Amazon Watch, and we're coming to you today as part of the True Cost of Chevron Network in collaboration with the Protect the Protest Task Force to bring a virtual event related to Chevron and their activities globally. It's called Anti-Chevron Day, and it's been in existence since 2014. On May 21st in 2014, there were protests directed at Chevron on 5 continents, in fact, 20 different countries, affected communities around the world that have been trying to draw attention to the fact that Chevron has been violating human rights and destroying the environment in many countries around the world. And often when faced with pushback from those communities, Chevron's actions make it stand out as one of the worst oil companies in the world because they, in fact, tend to attack the very people that they've harmed through their operations. So today we're going to hear more from communities that have been affected by Chevron and activists and lawyers and organizers who have worked to confront Chevron's actions, and some of whom have been targeted by the company for doing so. We're going to start out by hearing from folks from Richmond, California. And while you're hearing presentations, you'll also see on your screen ways that you can get engaged. Everyone should be using the hashtag anti-Chevron, and you'll see other messages that you can join in to support during those activities. Thanks for joining us, and let's move to our first discussion. Okay, thank you. So as part of Anti-Chevron Day, as I mentioned, we're going to have community members from different areas affected by Chevron come and share their stories and talk to people about Chevron's operations and different elements of Chevron's violations of human rights and the environment. So today, at this stage, we have Zolbo Namhaidorj from Communities for a Better Environment and from the Our Power Coalition. Welcome, and maybe you could start out by telling us what those two organizations are and what your role is.
So my name is Zolbo, and I am the Richmond youth organizer at Communities for a Better Environment. We're also known as CBE, and we are one of the OG environmental justice organizations in the country. We are a little over 40 years old, and right now we organize in 4 environmental justice communities: Richmond, East Oakland, Southeast LA, and Wilmington, all communities which are disproportionately impacted by air pollution and are low-income communities of color. And we operate under a triad model, so we have organizing, legal and policy, and then research and science. And as for the Richmond Our Power Coalition, we are a 9-member coalition of different, social justice organizations fighting for a just transition in Richmond. So working towards a regenerative economy that really values deep democracy and workers, and moving away from an extractive economy that doesn't value people or our labor.
Great, thank you. So in Richmond, as a lot of people may not know, Chevron's had a refinery for over 100 years there. Can you talk to us about what impacts that has had on the community, what CBE and Our Powers Coalition's work does vis-a-vis that refinery, and then we maybe can get into some of the topics specific to environmental racism and how Chevron plays a role in that.
Yeah, just for some background information, like you said, the refinery has been present in the community for a long time. It was initially established on a landfill in 1902, and it's had a really huge impact on not only just, air pollution, but also the politics and the economy. So for example, one of the high schools in Richmond High School, their mascot is the Oilers, which is a literal oil can since at least 1912. And that's not normal,
Yeah.
And in 2014, Chevron spent $3.5 million on the Richmond mayoral and the city council races. Thankfully, all of their candidates lost, but you can see, how much they are really working to like corrupt local politics, to, inhibit local regulations like the 2014 modernization project. And because of that, Richmond is one of the first communities to establish environmental justice as a framework.
And in 2012, right, that refinery exploded and sent 15,000 people to the hospital.
Right.
And obviously we could talk about who those people were, but we know that Chevron was found criminally liable for violating EPA regulations. And that's the reason that that fire happened. It was so devastating to the community.
One thing to note is when that huge explosion happened, there were only 2 hospitals in Richmond at the time. One of them has since closed down, and Richmond has the highest amount of, hospitalizations from asthma and like respiratory diseases in the entire Contra Costa County. And so if you don't have Kaiser, or if you can't go to Kaiser, then you need to go all the way to like Oakland or elsewhere to get healthcare.
And can you paint us a picture of the communities that are living in Richmond and that are close to the refinery?
80% or more of folks that are living within a mile of the Chevron refinery are people of color. Richmond historically was a Black and African American city, and that population is experiencing, huge levels of displacement from gentrification and with the building of like the new ferry, for example. And so now it is mostly Latinx, but most of the population makeup is mostly Latinx folks, still a fair number of Black and African American folks, and Asian folks, mostly Southeast Asian.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that Chevron also tried to take over essentially the local government there. My understanding is that happened after the city sued them, right? Because of the fire, didn't they win a $25 million lawsuit against Chevron? And then, as they've done in so many other places where they operate, instead of actually paying what they owe and doing right by the communities that they've harmed, instead they try to take over the local political system or otherwise pressure and make people go away who are their critics. Has that been the experience that you've seen?
Yeah, definitely. And, on that note, just last month, Chevron came to a settlement with our regional air district, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, and they agreed to pay $146,500 for 33 air quality violations from 2016 to 2018. That's barely a drop in the bucket, and that's less than $5,000 per violation for all of these, for all of the harm that they're doing to the community.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, and they continue to post massive quarterly profits. And I know they just gave a dividend to all their shareholders, which was the same as the prior quarter. So even in the midst of everything that's happening, they're still sending money back to their shareholders and reaping profits, and clearly at the expense of communities that are really paying the price. Is there a call to action or what you'd like people to do so they can learn more about the situation in Richmond and get involved and support community members?
Yeah. One thing I'll just add is that right now within the city of Richmond, there is a AB 617 monitoring program steering committee, and Chevron currently has a seat on there. And this particular committee is working to basically monitor the pollution, even though Richmond has, gone through many air monitoring projects for years, and the intention is for Richmond to, then be moved into being a community emissions reduction program community, right? Or SERP, as it's also known. That design team is working to end Chevron's domination of the AB 617 process. So I would suggest folks look that up. The second thing I would say is to just get involved with Communities for a Better Environment. We're doing work on some of their flaring violations that have been happening. They've had a huge increase in flare over the last year. And you can find out more information on our website at cbecal.org, or you can also find out more information about our youth program that I manage on our Instagram at R as in Richmond, youth, and then EJ like environmental justice.
So thank you again for being here with us today, Zolva, and thanks for your work and for supporting Anti-Chevron Day. I hope everyone takes action in support of your community, and thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
You too.
Hi, my name is Katherine Lee, and I am the Richmond Youth Organizer at Asian Pacific Environmental Network, also known as APEN. Here at APEN, we organize Asian immigrant and refugee communities to fight for environmental justice. I am anti-Chevron because Chevron has been poisoning my community for too long. I grew up in Richmond, California, home to many working class people of color. I've always admired Richmond's mild weather and beautiful diversity of different cultural backgrounds. Unfortunately, right in the middle of my city is a giant Chevron refinery. This Chevron refinery is the hugest polluter of all of California. On top of rising rents, low job opportunities, and lack of access to healthy food, we have to deal with Chevron. Chevron is a multi-billion-dollar corporation and has continued to show that they're willing to do anything to maintain their profits, even if it's at the expense of our health. Chevron continues to release emissions into the air, while people in my community suffer from the highest rates of asthma in both children and adults compared to the national average. On top of rising rents, low job opportunities, and lack of access to healthy food, we have to deal with Chevron. When I was 13, there was an explosion at the Chevron refinery. I was at my aunt's in a different city at the time, but I remember turning on the news and seeing huge clouds of smoke coming from the Chevron refinery. Everyone in Richmond was advised to go inside their houses, shut their doors, and shut their windows to not let any air in. 15,000 people had to seek medical treatment from that day. I remember being scared for my friends and family, wondering what would happen next. I remember being concerned for my little sister, who was only a year old at the time and already dealing with asthma issues, so I was worried that the smoke from the air would irritate her breathing. I also had my aunts, my cousins, and my grandma living in Richmond. Throughout my teenage years, I spent my time attending rallies and protests against big corporations like Chevron. I don't want young people to fight this fight into their adulthood like I did. I want to see a future where parents want to keep their families in Richmond without the fear of a Chevron refinery fire in their backyard. I want to see a future where Richmond residents have clean and healthy air. On top of poisoning our community, Chevron continues to rob us of at least $4 million a year by taking advantage of a tax cut that was meant to keep seniors in their homes. This is money that we could be using for roads, hospitals, and better education. This year, APEN is mobilizing our community to vote yes on schools and communities first, so that corporations like Chevron could pay their fair share for our local services and public schools. I'm looking forward to the day where Chevron starts to take accountability for their actions and show compassion for the communities that they've been harming. Till that day happens, I'm going to continue my fight and continue organizing. Join me in standing up for big polluters. Go to apen4ej.org and sign up to volunteer. Thank you.
Mi nombre es Donald Moncayo. Yo nací el 20 de noviembre de 1973 aquí en la Amazonía ecuatoriana. ¿Por qué soy anti-Chevron? Porque durante la operación de la empresa desde el año de 1964 hasta el año de 1990, construyó más de 356 pozos, más de 1.700 kilómetros de vías de acceso y 22 estaciones de separación con algunas subestaciones a sus alrededores. En estas estaciones de separación pues separaban el petróleo, el agua y el gas. El gas, una parte lo quemaban, otra parte se esparcía en el ambiente. El petróleo, que era lo que les interesaba, pues se llevaban. El agua de formación, que no les interesaba, realmente lo virtieron hacia los ríos, hacia los riachuelos, que estos a su vez tenían conexión con el río Napo y el río Guarico, y estos ríos a su vez se conectaban y terminaban en el Océano Atlántico. En estos más de 1.700 kilómetros de vías de acceso que construyeron, regaban petróleo cada 3, cada 4 meses, dizque para que no hubiera polvo, para que no las vías de acceso en el momento que pasaban sus vehículos no generaran polvo. En las piscinas, ahí donde arrojaban todos los lodos de perforación, el agua que utilizaban para la perforación, los químicos, el petróleo de prueba y todo el mantenimiento de pozo que le llaman los gore cover, que esas piscinas tenían una profundidad de 3 a 6 metros. El diámetro de las piscinas no importaba. Pues habían unas piscinas como ser la piscina del Pozo Guanta 8, que hay una cancha de fútbol sobre ella y sobra piscina. Para que tengan más o menos una idea. Y estas piscinas a su vez tenían un tubo que nosotros le llamábamos cuello de ganso, técnicamente tubo con codo, con dirección hacia los ríos, hacia los riachuelos, hacia los pantanos, hacia las lagunas, todas afluentes de agua dulce. En el año de 1995 la empresa regresa al Ecuador después de que nosotros habíamos presentado la demanda el 3 de noviembre de 1993. Dice que para hacer una remediación de 1995 a 1998, remedian 162 piscinas. Remediación es el fraude ambiental más grande de la historia cometido. Es venir y arrojarle tierra sobre estas piscinas, tapar, ocultar, no permitir que la gente mire, observe. ¿Sí? Y en esa famosa remediación invierten 40 millones de dólares que hoy en día lo difunden a nivel internacional. 40 millones de dólares que les costó alquilar volquetas y tractores para tapar todos los desechos tóxicos que están ahí. Señores directivos de Chevron, señores accionistas, es momento que ustedes se reivindiquen con la sociedad, con los amazónicos. Ustedes tienen la plata, nosotros tenemos el daño. 25 años de juicio, les hemos ganado el juicio. No permitan que más vidas sigan partiendo por su culpa. Permitan que el ser humano amazónico, tanto de las nacionalidades indígenas como colonos, mueran con dignidad. Paguen para limpiar el daño que ustedes cometieron en la Amazonía ecuatoriana. Este 27 de mayo ustedes tienen una gran responsabilidad en su reunión virtual de decidir el futuro de la Amazonía ecuatoriana, que es el pulmón del mundo, y la sociedad planetaria. Ya no se escondan más detrás de procesos judiciales, que eso les daña más la imagen de su empresa, de ustedes mismos como accionistas, que año a año ven cómo sus ingresos aumentan, mientras que familias acá siguen padeciendo el desastre cometido ambientalmente por ustedes, señores directivos de Chevron. Si les queda un poquito de dignidad, si quieren realmente lavarse la cara con las dos manos, empiecen por limpiar, por lavar la suciedad dejada en la Amazonía ecuatoriana.
Thank you for being with us on Anti-Chevron Day. You have just heard from Donald Moncayo in Ecuador about Chevron's contamination there. And I think it's important to take a few more minutes to talk about the significance of this disaster in Ecuador, not only what Texaco did, but what Chevron has done since then. I'm the Associate Director at Amazon Watch. We have been working to pressure Chevron to clean up Ecuador for almost 20 years. And the campaign that we have waged has put us in the crosshairs of Chevron. We've been attacked, labeled as conspiracy, a global conspiracy against them. We have been the target of PR efforts to smear our image, and we have suffered Chevron's legal attacks for doing so. It's important to point out that Chevron's acts of environmental destruction, human rights violations, legal abuses, intimidation tactics, and suppression of free speech have actually created a new playbook for corporations who are seeking to silence their critics. And this all stems from the fact that, as you heard, Texaco, which was the first oil company to drill for oil in the Amazon, designed a system to deliberately pollute as a cost-saving measure. This was a practice that they started in Ecuador unlike any other, because outside of Ecuador, the laws were very clear that dumping toxic waste was a violation of the law. But in Ecuador at the time, they were able to get away with saving $3 a barrel by dumping their toxic waste right into the rainforest. In the United States, the law at the time was that toxic foundation waters, drilling waters that come up before you drill for crude or when you drill for crude, need to be held in safe storage tanks and then re-injected into the earth afterwards. That was not the practice that Texaco led, and they did that for decades. That's why when they left, there were 16 billion gallons of toxic waste sitting in the Amazon rainforest, polluting and poisoning the drinking water of indigenous and other farmer communities every single day. So they left in 1992, and a class action lawsuit was brought against them in New York as Texaco. Texaco then argued for 10 years that that was not the proper venue and wanted to have the case dismissed from the courts in New York. They won that. After delaying justice for almost a decade, they won a decision, and they agreed that they would abide by any decision brought in the Ecuadorian courts. So Ecuadorian communities already suffering decades of pollution were forced to wait again, yet another 10 years, as they sued Chevron, because at that point, Chevron acquired Texaco. It is the same company. They operate with the same brand. They have the same assets and liabilities. And so the Ecuadorians renewed their suit, this time in Ecuador against Chevron. That again took almost a decade. Chevron did everything it could to try to derail and delay that case. And despite that fact, based almost majority of the scientific samples that Chevron submitted to the court, the company was found liable for $9.5 billion to pay to clean up the toxic waste and assist the communities with health costs. This isn't an opportunity for people to try to get rich off of a rich oil company, as Chevron would have people believe with their PR spin. It was actually a decision that forced Chevron to pay to clean up the toxic waste that it admitted to deliberately dumping in the Amazon in the first place. And that's another important point. The company admitted to creating this waste. All it tried to do to get out of it was say that it wasn't their responsibility, but because the government of Ecuador signed a release saying that Texaco could spend $40 million on a cleanup operation, and that would get them off the hook for its operations. The release that they signed did not protect Chevron from a civil lawsuit, which is what happened in Ecuador. And it also said that Texaco cleaned up a portion of the pits. Well, the truth of the matter is that what Texaco did was push dirt over top of those pits. And there is plenty of scientific evidence. You can go there today to see that the waste pits that they allegedly cleaned are still contaminating the area. And people who have moved on since then and moved onto those lands are getting sick and dying. So even their alleged cleanup was a sham. And Chevron, knowing that it was going to be held liable for that money, withdrew its assets from Ecuador and then preemptively sued the Ecuadorian people and their lawyers in the United States, the very same district where they had argued as Texaco that the case should not be heard. They went back and orchestrated a fraudulent case based on the false testimony of bribed witnesses alleging that the Ecuadorian case was a fraud. Now, the Ecuadorian case has been upheld on appeal. It went to the appeals court, it went to the Supreme Court. It's even been upheld by Ecuador's constitutional court. And they all examined the evidence, and they also examined Chevron's claims of fraud and dismissed them. Yet Chevron found a way to sue in the United States in front of a court that refused to hear evidence of Chevron's contamination, and that said, that never read the Ecuadorian verdict, and that accepted Chevron's testimony, the testimony of a witness that Chevron paid $2 million and coached 53 days, who later admitted that he lied on the stand for Chevron and in order to get a bigger payout. Yet Chevron has used this ruling in the United States to sway international media and to go basically around the world arguing that the case in Ecuador was a fraud. Even though they admitted to the initial crime, the evidence remains to this day, and all of the arguments that they brought forth in their retaliatory suit in the United States have been blown away by the fact that their witness admitted that he lied and that forensic evidence disproved their claims. Despite this fact, this is an example of how a rich oil company in the United States can twist and turn things to its favor in a different venue using armies of lawyers. They hired 60 law firms, over 2,000 legal professionals, all to argue that Chevron should not be held liable. And during the course of this, they attacked the very people that they poisoned and those who stood with them. And that is part of the reason that Chevron has won the Public Eye Award for the worst corporation in its history. That is why Chevron was tagged as Legal Bully of the Year 2 years in a row by the Protect the Protest Coalition. And that is why we have Anti-Chevron Day. It's worse than just committing the violation. They've attacked the very people who have worked to bring them to justice. And year after year, at their shareholder meeting, which is going to happen in 1 week, they trot out this retaliatory verdict in the United States as if it exonerates them in some way for what it did in Ecuador, when even the ruling itself says that Chevron is in no way exonerated by that decision, nor did it make any ruling as to the contamination, whether Chevron was liable. It was simply a fraudulent scheme concocted by Chevron to try to get off from having to have their assets seized in the United States. And it's a fundamentally racist approach because it ignores the entire judiciary of Ecuador. It says that the entire system is corrupt and that the only judge who can be trusted is a white judge from the US Southern District federal judge in New York named Lewis Kaplan. So as the Ecuadorians have sought to enforce their verdict in other countries like Canada, for example, Chevron has tried to use this RICO decision, this retaliatory lawsuit, to get off the hook. But time and again, as people look at the reality of what's happened in Ecuador, the case that Chevron brought in the United States is demonstrated to be a fraud. It's really important to learn how Chevron has done this because this tactic is being used by others. It's essentially what we call a slap suit. And later we're going to hear from Lauren Regan from the Civil Liberties Defense Center as to how Chevron and companies like it are using slap suits to try to silence critics and activists from holding them to account. Thanks for listening. Let's move on to our next presentation and discussion. And if you want to learn more about Chevron's activities in this case, you can go to chevrontoxico.com or amazonwatch.org. Thank you.
Mi nombre es William Lusitante de la nacionalidad Cofán. Yo soy anti-Chevron porque la violación de derechos por parte de Chevron continúa. Chevron obtiene recursos económicos a base del sacrificio de nuestras vidas. Hay muchas personas que padecen de cáncer y que han fallecido. Nuestros ríos están contaminados. El derecho a la alimentación como pueblos indígenas que tenemos también está afectado por la contaminación. Hemos luchado 26 años, vamos para 27 años de lucha y no encontramos la justicia. Queremos vivir dignamente, por eso mantenemos en posición firme en esta lucha. La sentencia ecuatoriana está firme. Chevron es culpable y tiene que pagar los daños causados para reparar la Amazonía ecuatoriana.
Okay, thanks. I'm really excited now. We're joined by Oriol Ullman, Senior Campaign Coordinator with the Union of Concerned Scientists. And we want to have another discussion about Chevron and their particular role in climate change and where they rank vis-a-vis other oil companies, because there are more reasons to be anti-Chevron, and a lot of it has to do with their pollution and effect on climate. So welcome, Oriol, and thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Paul, for letting us be part of this day. So yeah, like you said, I'm a campaign coordinator with the Union of Concerned Scientists. We're a science-based nonprofit advocacy organization. We want to make sure that sound science is being included in all of our country's decision-making, including about our energy mix, making sure that we're making good choices for the climate. So I specifically work on our fossil fuel company accountability campaign. We're focused on holding fossil fuel companies accountable for their role in climate change and for the damages they've caused. So Chevron, obviously here, is a really big player. And one of the main things that we've been focused on studying and amplifying over the past years has been that fossil fuel companies, as you know, were aware more than 50 years ago about the risks of their products, and taking actions that they could have taken to protect people and to protect our planet, they actively chose to instead deceive the public and block climate policies. And so the emissions tied to just the top 90 companies since 1880, the Industrial Revolution, which is when kind of emissions started to really boom. Emissions from just the top 90 companies contributed to nearly half of global temperature increase, about a third of sea level rise, and over half of ocean acidification. And so when we think about how much these companies knew so long ago about the harms that their product was going to cause and is causing, and how they chose not to protect us from those impacts, we really start to think about, okay, who's responsible? These companies love to make us think that individuals are responsible, to try to say, what are you doing to reduce your own carbon footprint? But the fact is that You and I and individuals didn't launch a decades-long campaign to make sure that the public was hooked on fossil fuel companies to end up where we are now. And when we look at the choices that they made and we look at the impacts of that choice to knowingly cause harm, we can also think about what companies specifically are responsible, not just the entire fossil fuel industry, but we can actually zoom in on some of the individual companies. And when we think about global temperature increase, sea level rise, and ocean acidification, which is where most of the research that UCS scientists has done lies, Chevron is actually the worst in all three of those.
No surprise.
Yeah, they tend to be kind of quiet. They don't make a lot of outlandish public statements. And so they kind of get to fly under the radar on this. But when you drill into the science, they are really one of the worst emitters historically.
Mm-hmm.
So some of our research in that, looking at like diving into emissions, what companies are the worst emitters, looking from just 1965 through 2015. And that 1965 date is important because, again, that's when we know that the industry really knew what was happening. They knew about the harms of their products in 1965. They knew that climate change was coming. And during just that period of time, if we trace just the top 5 investor-owned oil and gas companies, those same impacts that I talked about before, temperature rise, sea level rise, ocean acidification, those 5 companies account for 6% of sea level rise, 7% of global temperature increase, and 8% of ocean acidification. And again, Chevron is at the top of all of those emissions tied to Chevron's product. So it's really shocking. You know, you can go all the way back to the Industrial Revolution, but even when you just go back to when they knew they were causing harm, Chevron has been doing this a long time.
Wow. I mean, it's like, it's time and again, you see them get to pass kind of under the radar. Like, people remember Exxon Valdez and of course, Deepwater Horizon. And, you know, we're going to hear about the situation in Ecuador, which is so many times worse. But Chevron doesn't get, it's not a household name as this amazingly terrible global polluter and bad, you know, corporate actor, which still is shocking to me. And I guess that's part of the reason we have an anti-Chevron Day, to help people understand that. So what is the Union of Concerned Scientists specifically doing, and how can people engage and learn more about this particular issue and support the work?
Yeah, so one of the things that we're focused on is making sure that fossil fuel companies are held accountable for their climate damages. And a really exciting thing that we've been amplifying and that we've been creating science to help support the argument that they should be held accountable for their damages, is that there's a number of lawsuits, which UCS is not party to, but which we believe that our science supports. There's a number of lawsuits against Chevron and other fossil fuel companies for their contributions to climate change. So things like sea level rise, temperature increase, ocean acidification, these cause specific damages in communities, right? They threaten homes and infrastructure. They threaten the fishing industry and the tourism industry, and they contribute to public health crises and lots of real, like, definitive costs that communities and taxpayers are currently facing. And because Chevron and other companies made an active decision to lie about climate science, to block climate policies, now communities including Richmond, which, where Chevron is headquartered, well, not headquartered, but where they're very active, and throughout the Bay, as well as all over the country, there are over a dozen communities, state and local governments that are currently suing Chevron for those damages. Because right now, Chevron is basically saying, you caused this problem, taxpayers should be responsible for all of the costs of climate change, and we don't believe that's true. And taxpayers, frankly, don't believe that's true either. And so we want to be part of that solution of helping hold Chevron and other fossil fuel companies accountable. So one thing that people can do is ask their local governments, their city or state local governments, how much is this actually costing us? Because taxpayers are currently on the hook for every penny of climate costs for adaptation and mitigation and response efforts. And a lot of cities aren't doing the accounting to actually know what that's costing. So a first step is to just say, what is climate change actually costing our city and our state? And make it explicit. Say that taxpayers are currently on the hook for this. And then the second thing is to say, okay, how else can we pay for this? And how are we going to hold the industrial polluters who really created this problem? How are we as a city going to hold them accountable? And UCS has a lot of, like I said, scientific resources and some other helpful historical resources that can help you, make the argument that fossil fuel companies should be the ones to pay their fair share.
Well, they've profited off of it for ages. And that's the other thing too. It's
and
not,
still are.
Right. And they're like, oh, but we provide an essential service, et cetera. And that in the meantime, they're still extracting massive amounts of profit and saying, oh, but this work is so hard, et cetera. Like that profit should be going back into paying for this for sure. I mean, that's part of the reason we have what's called the true cost of Chevron network, because that's true cost of their operations, and that's what's hidden. Wow.
Yeah, exactly. They are masters of internalizing all the profits and externalizing all of the costs. And it's time that people really call on them to change that and call on our governments to help change that.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much for sharing that information. I hope everybody takes action and gets involved and supports that, because it affects every single one of us, whether you live near Chevron or not. We're all suffering because of their actions. Great. Well, thanks again for joining us on Anti-Chevron Day.
Thank you, Paul.
And I hope to see you soon.
Absolutely.
My name is Ada Racinos, and I live in Richmond, California. Chevron is in our backyard. The most recent flaring incident was February of this year. The only reason we haven't seen a flare-up since is because oil prices have gone down, and we know production has slowed down. Chevron is one of Richmond's largest employers, so we know people will begin to lose their jobs. It's time for a just transition now.
Okay, so now we're back, and right now I'm being joined by Anthony Collins, who's with 350.org in Australia. Chevron operates all around the world, and some people may know there's already been a lot of issues with their behavior in Australia. We've seen members from the community in Australia come to the shareholder meetings in the past to challenge the company. So I wanted to have a conversation with Anthony to talk about the concerns there and educate the community about why Anti-Chevron Day is an important day in Australia as well. So welcome, and let's hear it. Tell us a little bit about your organization and your work.
Yeah, well, thanks for having us on to start with. So I work with 350.org here in Perth in Western Australia. But I work closely with other organisations too. We have a big problem here in Western Australia. The gas industry, the LNG industry is dominant, and Chevron are the biggest polluters in the state. So the carbon emissions that they produce in Western Australia, the carbon emissions they produce are over 20% of the entire state's carbon emissions. So it's a huge problem. There's other projects which are sort of up and coming and on the table with another company called Woodside, which would be horrendous if that goes through. But yeah, at the moment, as things stand, Chevron have got two projects on the go. There's Gorgon, which is on an island offshore called Barrow Island, and Wheatstone, which is on the mainland, sort of parallel with that island. They were given $60 million of federal money when they started the Gorgon project to have a carbon capture and storage plant on site. So when they pull the gas up out of the reservoir, there's obviously other gases in there, such as carbon dioxide, methane, etc. And what they one of the agreements that they that were put under when they were given this money was the money that they draw up from this reservoir. Sorry, the gas even that they draw up from this reservoir. 80% of carbon dioxide that comes out of that, they're supposed to sequester back under the island, but the plant, they didn't manage to get the plant up and running until last year, and the plant has been running for 2.5 years. So there's been literally millions and millions of tons of carbon just being vented into the atmosphere.
And there's no government pushback on that? No, they're not violating regulations? And
there's an agreement that that's what they're supposed to do, but there's the government basically kind of say, oh, you shouldn't have done that. And nothing really happens. The gas industry here in WA have a lot of power over government here, which is a huge problem.
Yeah, we hear a similar story in other places where Chevron operates. They violate local regulations. They affect the environment and either pay little or no fines and go on with business as usual. Meanwhile, the communities living there are the ones that suffer, or our climate in general. So has there been organized action to pressure Chevron to either leave or stop its operations or comply with the law?
There's been a lot more action against Chevron and the gas industry in general in Western Australia over the last sort of couple or 3 years. There was a big lobbying effort from the gas industry last year that happened. We have the Environmental Protection Authority here, which is an independent government authority that can recommend. They have the power to recommend to government what they should implement. And last year they implemented that any new fossil fuel projects over a certain amount that emits over a certain amount of carbon dioxide should offset 100% of their emissions. Immediately they got so much pushback from the gas industry, including Chevron. And within a week, they'd been made to totally retract their recommendations by government. After, I think, Mark McGowan, who's the Premier here, he came out of a meeting with basically all of the CEOs of Chevron, Woodside, Santos, and all the others, and then within a few hours said, the EPA came out and said that they were retracting their recommendations. So they also, as I know they do elsewhere in the world, Chevron have their name over absolutely everything here, everything that's good. So when it comes to the arts here in Perth, the gas industry has its name on Perth International Arts Festival, on the Fringe Festival that's here, on the ballet, on all of the wonderful cultural things that we have here, plus sports teams. There's a fun run here, City to Surf. So we've been 350. We've been trying to pressure City to Surf, which is a fun run here, and the Perth International Arts Festival, who are both sponsored by Chevron, to drop that sponsorship. And it's difficult because obviously it's a lot of money, but it's a moral issue now.
That's the strategy Chevron has globally. They throw millions and millions of dollars to greenwash or whitewash their image by giving to other things, hoping that people will then ignore the crimes that they're committing, sometimes in the very same community. Oakland Ballet, was sponsored by Chevron. The baseball teams here are sponsored by Chevron. Meanwhile, they're polluting the very air that those teams are playing in, and hoping that we'll give them a pass.
And it's difficult here as well, because like when you get talking to people about how bad Chevron are, like Western Australia is a completely different animal to the rest of Australia, and a lot of other places across the world. Everyone here is either related to or knows someone who works for the like energy or resources industry. So we are a resources state. We have like BHP, Rio Tinto, like all of the big names in mining are here in Western Australia. It's a huge state with a lot of resources in it. So it's really difficult to kind of get people to realize that the people who are paying them aren't necessarily doing the right thing.
Yeah. Well, how can people find out more about what's happening there and get engaged with the efforts in Australia to combat Chevron?
So you can keep an eye on 350.org.au we've got a lot of stuff going on at the moment. We've just released fossil fuel.watch, which is keeping an eye on basically we've just had the National COVID Commission started in the last few months, obviously looking after the COVID crisis, and everyone appointed to that, well, not everyone, but most people appointed to that are from the mining or resources or industry. And the main guy, Nev Power, has quoted as being very pro gas. So we're kind of profiling them and keeping an eye on what the fossil fuel industry is asking for recovery, but also more sort of state focused in Western Australia, and more gas focused, and more to do with what Chevron are working on here. There's an organisation that I work with closely, cleanstate.org.au, and they have some excellent reports on the gas industry and new emissions, jobs that could come about if the government weren't so focused on gas and were focused on more on clean jobs. It's all on Clean State. I'll keep an eye on those two. And
Well, thank you, Anthony. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for being anti-Chevron. And keep up the good fight. Well, hopefully people will engage and support the work that you're doing.
Thank you very much for having me.
Soy Justino Piaguaje, presidente de la Nación Siecopain de la Amazonía Ecuatoriana. Soy anti-Chevron porque por este río Aguarico, hace tiempos en la explotación petrolera de Chevron Texaco, virtieron miles de barriles de petróleo, virtieron aguas tóxicas por este río que a nosotros por miles de años nos proveía de alimentos. Mientras ustedes, accionistas de Chevron, el dinero se llenaban en sus cuentas, en sus bolsillos, yo soy testigo de cómo ha sido víctima nuestra gente. Se han muerto de cáncer, se han muerto de enfermedades, no han podido alimentarse bien y seguimos siendo así. Por eso soy anti-Chevron.
Okay, thanks everybody. Now we're going to talk with John Noel, Senior Climate Campaigner at Greenpeace USA, and hear something about what's happening with the COVID crisis and how the fossil fuel industry, and we assume Chevron as part of it, is taking advantage of this situation. So welcome, John. Please tell us a little bit about yourself, and let's talk about what's happening today with COVID.
Sure, Paul. Thanks for having me. I'm John. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm based in Washington, D.C. And I've been tracking the oil industry's efforts to manipulate the COVID public health and economic crisis for private gain. The oil and gas industry, including Chevron, are being hit by the COVID crisis because not many people are driving or flying or traveling, et cetera. So oil demand is down. And so they're using this moment to pull any lever that the government has available to help them weather this storm. And there's a number of different ways that the oil industry is using their access to policymakers, including a direct line to the president, in order to help them come out of this situation on top. And we know that the oil and gas industry's financial problems predated COVID. I mean, these companies have a ton of debt. It is expensive to drill for oil. They cannot stop drilling even when no one is buying the oil. They have to keep drilling in order to pay off their debts.
Yeah, Chevron, I know, lost over $100 million worth of value just the year prior to this. They've been in a spiral.
Yeah, they're not in good shape. And so this is almost a blessing in disguise because they can go to the government and say, hey, we need help to get through this crisis. But really, their financial problems started long before this. And I can talk about a couple of different ways that the oil and gas industry has been trying to take advantage of this crisis. And one of them is to stop paying royalties for oil and gas production on public lands, right? So it's essentially they're asking to not pay taxes for producing resources that are owned by all of us, residents of the US. They're also, because no one is buying, the demand for oil is low, the oil companies don't have anywhere to store it all. Mm-hmm. And Chevron and Exxon were able to ink a sweetheart deal with the government to lease out storage space in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. So essentially, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is an emergency supply of oil used to help out in emergencies if we were ever to run out of oil. In this case, Exxon and Chevron were able to reverse that and say, hey, let us store our oil in the government's emergency stockpile while we wait for oil prices to go back up. That's pretty unheard of and not the purpose of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. So I was surprised about that. And Chevron is one of the 9 companies that's involved in that.
Not surprising, especially with this government, right, being so cozy with them.
Yeah.
And you know, what I've read is that Chevron has ultimately really paid zero taxes anyway, the way it actually operates.
Yeah, and what's really wild is the last stimulus package that Congress passed, called $2 trillion CARES Act, $2 trillion in loans and loan guarantees, et cetera, mainly they were meant to go to small businesses, like the businesses that our friends and family own, like movie theaters, cafes, bowling alleys, et cetera. The oil and gas industry has been able to capitalize on these loans. They're also asking the Federal Reserve to change some of the lending requirements. So these big companies, they want access to these small business pots of money. And the Federal Reserve increased the revenue size and the employee size to give access to these larger companies. They've also requested the Federal Reserve allow them to use these stimulus fund loans to pay off previous debts, which is pretty wild. They want to use these funds, which should be used for operating practices and keeping people on the payroll, but instead they want to use the stimulus funds to pay off debts. And there's a couple other ways we believe that there are multiple ways that they're still trying to manipulate this process that haven't even come out yet. And it's because we don't really know the companies that are actually getting the stimulus money, right? Because they're not required to report that in real time. The only way we can figure this out is to comb through the SEC filings, and that's delayed for months, and it's not happening in real time. So we won't really find out how much Chevron took through this stimulus process until, probably be a couple more months when we start to look at the numbers.
That's really infuriating because they just gave a dividend out to other shareholders this last quarter, which was the same as the quarter before that. So they haven't made any change in the way they're operating yet they're looking for all these bailouts and different types of support. And their shareholder meeting is in a week, and shareholders won't have any information to bring this up during the meeting. If what you're saying of not being able to find out for some time happens, it'll be a whole year before there's another shareholder meeting, an opportunity to push back from the people who are taking action within Chevron to make a change.
It is pretty egregious, especially when you compare it with the actual need for people and working families and people on the front lines who are just trying to survive the crisis, and they need help from the government to help get through this crisis and then able to thrive on the other side. But you have oil and gas companies dominating the news cycle. You know, the Trump administration are tweeting about taking care of the oil and gas industry. You don't see them tweeting about anything else. Right. You know, you have the Department of Energy secretary going on CNBC talking about all the things that are Department of Interior secretary talking about all the things they're doing to take care of the oil and gas industry. And these are big name players. It just doesn't, when that's juxtaposed with like what we know is actually happening, people dying, the virus spreading, and real fractures in our society are not being addressed. But at the top lines from the administration are, we're going to take care of the oil and gas industry.
Was there a way that people can take action to put some pressure on the government and generate awareness about what's happening so more people know and get involved?
Yes. I mean, you could go to our website, and there's a number of ways that we are trying to stop the bailout at the national level. And folks will be able to see those action alerts when you go to our website. And then hopefully, when it's safe to do so, we will be back in the streets or back doing something as soon as we can safely all come back together, because we really need to bring the heat on the other side of this. Right. We're not going back. Folks we're saying that the pandemic is a portal. It's a gateway between one way of living to the other. And we're not interested in opening up the previous system. We're going forward.
Yeah. Yeah. We can't let Chevron and all the rest of them go back to business as usual by any stretch. Well, thanks a lot. This has really been informative. I appreciate your time. Thanks for supporting Anti-Chevron Day. And I hope everyone takes action at the links that we provide and stays involved. Thanks a lot.
Paul.
"30 Nobel laureates have joined global human rights and environmental NGOs calling for an end to the home detention of human rights lawyer Stephen Donziger. Donziger played a key role in winning the landmark $9.5 billion judgment in Ecuador against Chevron for its deliberate pollution of the Amazon rainforest while operating as Texaco from 1964 to 1992. He has become Chevron's target in the company's stated campaign to, quote, demonize Donziger, unquote. In 2011, Chevron was found liable and ordered to pay $9.5 billion for deliberately polluting the Amazon by dumping 16 billion gallons of toxic waste into the rainforest, causing a massive health crisis. Instead of paying the judgment, Chevron withdrew its assets and fled the country. 916 toxic waste pits remain, poisoning the local drinking water to this day. Chevron should focus on a complete cleanup. Instead, with support from a U.S. federal judge, Chevron is attempting to silence Donziger and those who support him. Framed by Chevron with false evidence and testimony from a bribed witness, the judge has ordered Donziger to turn over his email passwords, phone, and computer to the court to give to Chevron. When Donziger appealed the order, the judge charged him with criminal contempt, seized his passport, and placed him in home detention. Donziger has been convicted of no crime, yet remains under house arrest for over 8 months, unable to pursue justice for the Ecuadorians poisoned by Chevron. Corporate power coupled with judicial abuse has run roughshod over the rights of a human rights lawyer pursuing justice in the largest case of oil-related environmental destruction in history. Chevron's attacks on Donziger must be stopped. the U.S. government must free Donziger today and investigate the ongoing violations and abuses by Chevron and its lawyers. Join Nobel laureates Greenpeace USA, Global Witness, Amazon Watch, Rainforest Action Network, and other activists call for the immediate release of human rights lawyer Stephen Donziger. Stand up to Big Oil.
Okay, so now we're here with Lauren Regan, the Executive Director of the Civil Liberties Defense Center. Thanks for joining us on Anti-Chevron Day, Lauren. And I'm really interested to hear what you have to say about Chevron's legal bullying and tell us about your work and also the Protect the Protest Coalition.
Sure. Thanks, Paul. And thanks for being a part of Anti-Chevron Day as well. Well, so I'm one of the lawyers that is representing Stephen Donziger in a federal prosecution that's currently taking place in the Southern District of New York. And I think that the case against Donziger is just one of many examples of how this multi-billion-dollar multinational fossil fuel corporation is unduly influencing our normal democratic processes. You know, this is a corporation that is so large that it literally acts with impunity around the world. It gets a, $19 billion judgment against it to clean up fossil fuel pollution that's killing people, and it just thumbs its nose at it and walks away. And in that process, it basically, vows to seek vengeance upon one of the public interest lawyers that represented the indigenous Ecuadorians. And so to me, the larger important message is, this is a fossil fuel corporation in the throes of catastrophic climate change that is trying to chill the rights of public interest lawyers and their clients to utilize the courts to redress grievances and seek justice. The idea that as a result of winning multi-billion-dollar judgments against a corporation, that corporation would go after the lawyer, one of the lawyers, is not how our systems of democracy are supposed to work. And I think what Chevron wanted out of this Donziger prosecution is for other environmental lawyers to look and see how the industry was treating him, trying to take away his bar license, trying to take away all his money and assets. He's currently on house arrest and has been on house arrest for 10 months where he hasn't been allowed to leave his home, and he's wearing an ankle bracelet. Like, other lawyers see that and they think, gosh, I don't want to sue Exxon or Chevron or any of these big corporations because I don't want that to happen to me. And that's one of the most important reasons why solidarity is so important in this context, both for lawyers, but also for our environmental and social justice movements. The Protect the Protest Coalition uses the slogan, "An attack on one is an attack on all." And I really think it's important for people who work within our movements to remember that, right now it's Stephen Donziger and he's being prosecuted in this crazy case in New York City. But there are other lawyers that have had similar attacks against them by Exxon and by other corporations. And if we don't stand up and defend the individual who's the target right now, we very likely may be the next target. And if the bullies think that these types of repressive tactics are effective for them, if it actually deters a lawyer from bringing a case to clean up pollution, or if it deters a community from going to the courts to try to, remedy some harm that they're experiencing at the hands of the fossil fuel industry, then, we all lose, and we all lose gravely.
Yeah, I mean, I recall when Chevron filed their retaliatory legal attacks, the Americans for Tort Reform, the pro-corporate organization, was quoted as saying, like, this is a new playbook to go after corporate gadflies. And not just the lawyers, right? Amazon Watch was drawn into that suit, reporters, bloggers, shareholder activists, all lumped into this supposed conspiracy, which intimidated and scared people. And some people had to spend a ton of money on lawyers to defend themselves from these baseless attacks. And who's going to want to go after companies if your whole livelihood is at risk just by bringing a complaint, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Chevron, I mean, we've heard a lot of reasons why they seem to be the worst of the worst in a lot of categories. And this is definitely one that has been really disturbing for, I know, the coalition itself, this Protect the Protest Coalition, which you mentioned, which has a lot of different organizations involved, the ACLU, Amnesty, Greenpeace, Sierra Club, etc. And everyone, as you're saying, feels like we need to stay together to support each other from these kinds of attacks. And Chevron has year after year been identified as the worst corporate bully by these groups, and for good reason.
Yeah.
Are there things that people can do to get engaged to support this case and also to kind of fight back against this type of corporate bullying?
Well, so with regard to this case, we are set for trial on June 15th, not far away, in New York City. We'll see whether or not the trial actually happens. It's going to be really important for the public to be watching this trial, and for the courts and the prosecutors to understand that this is a case of public interest, and is going to be scrutinized. There's been a lot of shenanigans that have gone on in the earlier parts of this case, all of them sort of smacking of undue influence by Chevron. For instance, after the Judge Kaplan, who used to work for the tobacco industry as a lawyer, so he obviously does not like plaintiffs' public interest lawyers, in general, one would imagine. But after he found Stephen in civil contempt of court for not turning over his computers and his attorney files to Chevron, Stephen immediately appealed that ruling. And while, a few days or a couple of weeks after the appeal was filed to the Second Circuit, Judge Kaplan made an unprecedented move of going to the U.S. Attorney's Office and saying, look, I wrote up these criminal charges. I want you to prosecute Stephen Donziger criminally. And the U.S. Attorney's Office said no. And so then the judge took an even further unprecedented move by appointing a private firm to act as the government's lawyer to prosecute him. And this private law firm, Seward and Kissel, took the case and basically stepped into the shoes of being the U.S. Attorney's Office. And just a few weeks ago, we found out that Seward and Kissel has Chevron and Chevron affiliates as clients. And so literally, Chevron has a private firm prosecuting Donziger criminally on behalf of the United States government. And the firm failed to disclose the conflict. We filed motions to dismiss based on this obvious conflict. And the court right now has denied it. We're about to go up on a mandamus to the Second Circuit. But that's just one example of how interwoven this corruption and collusion, and at least the appearance of bias and partiality, is playing out in, what is supposed to be one of the last remnants of neutral justice, you know, and of course we all know that there are systemic problems with the US justice system, you know, that would be naive to say otherwise. But when you see it so obvious and so blatant like this, it really makes you recognize that this corporation functions in the United States and around the world with impunity. You know, that saying too big to fail, you know, that came out during that 2008 crisis, in some ways it seems like too big to be held accountable for anything, including literally co-opting the judicial system. But so to answer your question, you know, what can you do? Well, if you're in New York, you know, come to the trial. You know, make Chevron cleanup.com, I believe, is the website where updates and information and ways to engage, you know, in the run up to the case are happening. If you're a lawyer, I know that there is an international committee of human rights lawyers that has created a sign-on letter. I think they have almost 1,000 lawyer signatures on this letter, seeking the release of Donziger and seeking the recusal of the private law firm. I believe there are lawyers that are organizing a complaint against Judge Kaplan for ethics violations. You know, so there's amicus briefs that are being put together by environmental and human rights organizations and lawyer organizations. So there's all sorts of things that are going on that are in play. And I think all of them focus around the idea that we need to make sure that this corporation and that the courts realize that this is a court of public concern and the people are going to be watching and the people are aware and they're paying attention to what is happening. Because I think really up until recently, this court and Chevron have been kind of operating in murky, dark shadows. Mm-hmm. And we really need to shine a light on this and make sure that, you know, people are loud and informed.
That's great. And I know this is also going to come up at the Chevron shareholder meeting in a week's time too. So thank you so much for being here today and explaining this absurd and infuriating situation that concerns us all.
Yeah, thanks, Paul.
Take care.
You too.
Okay, that's the end of the presentations that we have and the discussions for today for Anti-Chevron Day. There are many different things that you can do online. Please make sure you're visiting truecostofchevron.com, that you take action there, that you amplify the messages of these affected communities and others working to identify and expose Chevron's acts and hold them to account for their environmental destruction, human rights crimes, and legal bullying. I want to thank Zolvo Namhandorej, Oriol Ullman, Anthony Collins, John Noel, Lauren Regan for joining me today and for these wonderful discussions about Chevron. Also, UDAPT, the Union of Affected Peoples of Ecuador, APEN, the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, Communities for a Better Environment, the Richmond Our Power Coalition, 350.org in Perth, Australia, Greenpeace USA, the Union of Concerned Scientists, and the Protect the Protest Coalition, all in support of the True Cost of Chevron Network and Anti-Chevron Day. The Chevron shareholder meeting is May 27th in the morning, 8 o'clock Pacific Daylight Time. We want to continue social media action all the way up and during that day. Please take action, support the anti-Chevron work, and keep your ears and eyes ready for appeals that we will have for actions you can take related to the shareholder meeting in 1 week's time. Thank you again for all your support and for continuing the fight.